although I'm a slow starter, once I get down to it, I can concentrate very fiercely and I can work very fast. So I probably then work from 10 to 2 without a break, sort of 4 hours straight through. And then I would then take a break to walk around, maybe go and have lunch or go outside or read a book or, whatever it might be. And then I probably have another go at writing the book between 5 and 7, which I find also a very good time. So it's just a question of everyone's, body clock is different and everyone's brain works in a different way. It's very much like doing a crossword, actually. Sometimes with a cryptic crossword, you look at the clue and there are 3 parts of the clue and one answer, and you really work at it inductively, logically, and so on and so forth. And eventually you crack it. So you're like a code breaker. But then you get stuck halfway through and you go away and think about something else, and you come back and the 6 clues in the crossword which completely flummoxed you in the morning, you look at them and say, well, it's constabulary, isn't it? Or it's heads down, or, it's just obvious from the shape of the word, and, you just click, click, click. It's just because your brain has sort of reset itself to at a slightly different angle.
Welcome to a brand new episode of Writer's Routine. My name's Dan Simpson. This is the podcast where we take a look inside an author's working day. And this week, we are going big. We're chatting to Sebastian Faulks, one of the biggest names in literary fiction all across the world, really. He started his career as a teacher and a journalist, a book reviewer, working for The Telegraph and The Independent, and now he's a regular Sunday Times bestseller. And it was his 4th novel, Birdsong, that really kickstarted his career, sold millions of copies. There was a massive movie made about it. It's still taught in schools all over the place, and you can hear how that success completely changed his life. Sebastian is an in-demand author as well, known for continuing legacies. He's written official James Bond books, official, P.G. Wodehouse books. He's got a new memoir out too. It's called Fires Which Burned Brightly. You can hear all about the secrets of the roadmap that he uses to try and figure out where his plot's leading him. Also, why he thinks he was quite lucky to be publishing books when he has. And we run through how he plans a day to get a book written. Now, if you enjoy the show, please make sure you subscribe to this channel. Also, search for Writer's Routine wherever you normally listen to podcasts. We've got almost 400 of the biggest authors around revealing how they get to work. And this week, we'll get into it with Sebastian Faulks. And we start, as we always do, with what he sees around him in the place where he sits down to write.
There are pictures on the walls, and behind me is a pair of French doors which lead out onto a terrace where there are tomato plants growing. So the idea is that in the summer, you open the doors and the lovely smell of tomatoes comes in. But last year, there were none because there was no sun. So while we're moaning the sort of, terrible heat problems that the world is having, let's just remember that last summer in this country, there was no sun, literally none. So, it's terrible, but it's intermittent.
And we'll get the smell of tomatoes, which is always a boon, I think.
It's always good.
What about more so around you on the walls? Is there anything particularly inspirational?
There is a very large, what looks like the front of an enormous doll's house, which was in fact used on as a film set, and it represents a house in, I think, Wigmore Street or possibly Harley Street. It was used in a film of Little Dorrit made about 30 years ago. And there's a painting by Christopher Wood, who is an English painter of the 1920s, of whom I wrote a short life some years ago. There is a photograph by Lartigue, the French photographer, and there's a little oil painting done by a Royal College of Art student called Bobby Russon, which again dates from quite a long time ago, which was used as the jacket for my second book, The Girl at the Lion d'Or. So that's vaguely inspirational, I suppose.
How about stuff that's perhaps more pertinent to what you are writing? Post-it notes or planning material, anything that lets you know what you're there to do?
Yep. There are next to my chair is a chest, and in the bottom drawer of the chest there are about sort of 20 books which I've used for research or may need to refer back to. And then I have a large clipboard, literally a clipboard, like a sort of gas meter inspector or, whatever, quartermaster stores, which has various notes on it. But it rather varies from book to book. I mean, some books you take over a whole room and there are drawings and maps and charts and timelines on the walls. But the books I've been writing recently, I've tried to keep it fairly minimal so as not to spread out too much. And I used to have a sort of studio flat that I worked in, which was not at home. But since I'm working at home, I have to try and contain the mess a bit.
I don't know how theoretical this is, but have you noticed a change in then how you're writing by by not spread as much, by trying to contain your mess? Have you noticed any change in how you do things?
No, not really. Though every book is different. Every book you start, it's as if you've never written one before, really. You think, God, how do I do this? And every time it's different. And I mean, I used to write novels a bit like a sort of school essay. I would have a sort of piece of paper beside it with sort of 10 points I was going to cover. And I would sort of work methodically and directly through them until I'd finished. And of course, I was then using a typewriter. So there'd be a pile of paper growing by the side of the typewriter itself. And then other times I think of it more like painting now, really. I start with a blank canvas and I will start in one area and do something very detailed. And it's only after about a couple of weeks I realize that I'm spending all my time on a minor detail which is really of no importance in the finished canvas at all. So as if you're doing the Queen of Sheba arriving to visit Solomon, you spent 2 weeks on a small pet dog in the lower left. You think, come on, I've got to get an idea of her ship first of all, and the temple, and the king, and the queen, and so on. So it varies. It always changes. And also another big change for me was switching from typewriter to computer. I mean, although I'd been using a computer I used to work at the Independent newspaper, and we were the first people to use computers in the office. So that was in 1986. I didn't start using them for writing novels until 2006. So although I was very familiar with them, I felt very superstitious about abandoning the typewriter, because I like the sound of the keys, I like the smell of the ink on the ribbon, and I like the sense of a pile of paper growing beside the machine. It made you feel like you were achieving something, whereas when you shut down a computer or close down a laptop, there's nothing to show for it.
And to take you back 20 years to the great schism, moving towards a laptop, how did it go in the end?
I worried that my style would become very sort of slack and too fluid because it was so easy to correct. Whereas on a typewriter, you think before the sentence begins pretty carefully, because it's very wearing on the fingers and you have to use a lot of Tipp-Ex and crossing out and all that sort of thing. Whereas obviously on a laptop or on a computer, you just press delete and it's easy. And I thought it would affect the style, but I don't think it has. Though I do think my style has generally become. No, I'm not sure that's even true. I think basically your style depends on the book that you're writing. You have to find a tone of voice which suits the material for each book, and it will be different for each one.
Although your style may change depending on what it is you're writing and what tone you need to assume, what is there consistent about the way you write and the style that you generally have throughout your novels? Is that something that you can grasp?
It's not something I think about very much because, one doesn't want to become self-conscious about it. But I suppose people describe it as elegant and pared down and restrained. I'm not consciously trying I suppose I'm trying to be elegant, but I don't really think of it myself as pared down or restrained particularly. I think of it as quite florid at times. But above all, I think of it as whatever is apt for the subject matter. But I suppose I read an article once in which somebody noted how many words I used had Latin or Greek, ancestry or etymology. But your average reviewer and your average reader, in fact, isn't going to notice that very much. That may or may not be true. I just don't know.
I speak to a lot of more genre authors than perhaps you are at times. People who are thoroughly into crime or detective fiction at that. And they have to think quite keenly about what it is their reader wants with each book, the beats that they need to hear, how their style and voice is. I know that you've said you don't want to think too much about it because you don't want to make yourself self-conscious. But when you are writing, perhaps as you say, more floridly, how much do you think about that side of things and the voice that you are adopting and how the reader wants it to be?
Well, I think that maybe we're talking by style. You and I may mean slightly different things. I mean, by style, I'm really talking about the words in a sentence, and whether they're pitched at a conversational level or a more elevated level of vocabulary, rhythm, length of sentences, that call quite technical things. As far as thinking about the reader's expectations, I mean, I think that some ambitious or literary writers, I've read one or two saying, I never think about the reader. I only think about the beauty of the thing itself. Well, fine, but I think you're missing a trick because you're missing a sort of complexity there. Of course, you are trying to make something like a picture or like a statue, which is a sort of work of art, if you wish, and will stand in its own right without you having to support it. But at the same time, you can develop a relationship with the reader in which you are talking to the reader, as it were, round the back of what is happening in the book. So I'm aware sometimes that I'm raising expectations in them that are with a certain character or the way the story is going. And I know that I'm going to confound those expectations. But I have to be thinking about what the reader is thinking in order to surprise them or upset them or whatever. So in general, I do think about a reader quite a bit. And I think it's very important to write as well as you can and not to sort of talk down to the reader and not say to yourself, I can't make this reference or I can't use that word because they won't understand what I'm saying. I think once you start sort of taking that view, you're in danger of patronizing the reader, and then there's a danger that you're not really going to write the book you want to write anyway. And sometimes, I remember when I was about 15 or 16 and I was starting to read adult books, I wouldn't understand every word or every reference, but it didn't matter. I'm still getting the point of the book. But I think the relationship between the reader and the writer is very important, and I think writers who think nothing about it they're missing a chance to make their own book more complex and more interesting.
The show, Sebastian, is writer's routine. So take us through yours, if you'd be so kind. A day in the life of you writing a novel. How does the whole thing look?
Well, as I say in Fires Which Burn Brightly, most of the time you're not writing a novel, because if I wrote 1,000 words a day, which is absolutely standard for any kind of writer, really, I'd be publishing 3 books a year. And the public just doesn't have the appetite for that, and I don't have the ideas for that. So I suppose 2/3 of the time you're not writing. That's the first thing to understand about a typical day in the life of a writer. Consists of not writing anything. That's absolutely fundamental. The third of the time that you maybe are involved in writing a book, I don't start until I used not to start until I had a very clear idea of where I was going. But I always say to people, it's a bit like how people say, do you know what the ending is before you begin? To which my answer always used to be, yes, of course I do. I mean, it's like setting out from London to travel to Rome in a car. And I know that I'm going to go to Dover, Folkestone, get on the tunnel, the train in the tunnel. And then I would have about sort of 10 stops planned. And then I knew exactly where I'm ending up in Rome, in the square where the Parthenon is. But what happened between these 10 points along the way, that would vary. And that you hope would take you by surprise a bit. It's not sort of totally planned. You thought we were going to stop for lunch in Strasbourg, but we didn't get there. We took a side road, and that turned out to be really fruitful. And sometimes you have to let yourself go down the side road, but then you have to yank it back and say, look, we have to be in Milan by Friday. That's absolutely indispensable. And then so that's the sort, but that's normally the idea. So the actual day then itself would consist of, before I do anything, I have to do the crossword in the paper, in the Times. Can't really get into gear until I've done that. I'm a very slow starter of the day, and I got into the habit years ago when I worked as a journalist of reading the papers pretty much cover to cover before doing anything, which you had to do as a journalist. You couldn't arrive at work not knowing what was going on. So I've sort of vaguely stuck with that, and I get down to it at about 10 o'clock. But although I'm a slow starter, once I get down to it, I can concentrate very fiercely, and I can work very fast. So I probably then work from 10 to 2 without a break, sort of 4 hours straight through. And then I would then take a break to walk around, maybe go and have lunch or go outside or read a book or, whatever it might be. And then I probably have another go at writing the book between 5 and 7, which I find also a very good time. So it's just a question of everyone's, body clock is different and everyone's brain works in a different way. I mean, I can go all the way through. When I was writing a book called Human Traces, which was very long and required, phenomenal amounts of research. I mean, it took me 5 years, and I figured that if I took a break at all during the middle of the day, I would never finish it. So I gave up having lunch, and that was a good thing. So I would then work from 10 till 7 pretty much straight through. I would probably go for a stroll for half an hour or something, but I don't have to submit myself to quite that intense discipline anymore. So it's 10 to 4, 5 to 7, 6 hours. And 6 hours solid concentration a day is really quite a lot. It's probably more than most jobs. I mean, your average job is 9 to 5, but most of that you're standing around gossiping or going out to the sandwich bar or having meetings or whatever. You're not really doing much. So I feel that although 6 hours may not sound a hell of a lot, if you're completely focused in that time, you can get a lot done. And I think to work more than that, there is a risk that the returns will start to diminish. Having said which, sometimes I've had a bad day. Nothing's really come out in the 4 hours in the morning. All I've done is cut back what I've written before. So I thought I was at 25,000 words when I started, and I've ended up at lunchtime at 23 and a half because I've cut a whole lot. And then you go back at 5 thinking, oh my God, where are we going with this? And suddenly at about 6 o'clock, something clicks, and then you can rattle off 1,500 words in an hour. And so your day has been, overall positive.
Because you've written quite a few novels now, even though at the start you said that every time you sit down to write something new, you completely have forgotten how to do it. But on the bad days, when then it suddenly clicks, have you made any headway in figuring out why that might just happen and perhaps what's been holding you back for the previous 5 hours?
It's just a question of letting your mind slide in, maybe there are so many different ways in which one's mind works, and it's sort of pushing and pulling, sometimes focusing very tightly and other times letting it, opening up a few valves, as it were, to let some air in. It's very much like doing a crossword, actually. Sometimes with a cryptic crossword, you look at the clue and there are 3 parts of the clue and one answer, and you really work at it inductively, logically, and so on and so forth. And eventually you crack it. So you're like a code breaker. But then you get stuck halfway through and you go away and think about something else, and you come back and the 6 clues in the crossword, which completely flummoxed you in the morning, you look at them and say, well, it's constabulary, isn't it? Or it's heads down, or, it's just obvious from the shape of the word, and, you just click, click, click. It's just because your brain has sort of reset itself to at a slightly different angle. And that is something which can happen as well when you're trying to create. I think when nothing is happening, or you can't see a way forward, or you feel sort of bogged down, it's probably because you're focusing too fiercely and too logically. So that's the best answer I can give.
Sorry for interrupting. Just 1 second. We'll be back with more from Sebastian in a mo. If you're enjoying the show, please do think about subscribing to this YouTube channel. Also, search for Writer's Routine wherever you get your podcasts. That way they automatically download every single week, and you've got almost 400 of the biggest names around already on there. And if you fancy supporting the show, you can help us out on Patreon and Ko-Fi. That lets me keep bringing you these chats with the best authors around as often as I can. Links for both of those are in the description. So thanks for that, and let's get back into it with Sebastian Faulks. And you said that if you were to write 1,000 words a day every day, you'd be publishing so many books a year that everyone would get bored. So when you feel comfortable at a point when you can start the writing, how many days a week will you be working with that 1,000 words a day, hopefully?
Well, I suppose 6. As my wife said to me the other day, the trouble is you don't really have any hobbies apart from writing. So I would really, if you're writing something, it's much more interesting than the rest of your life, really. So you really want to be doing it. And the only reason I wouldn't work 7 days a week is because I don't want to be antisocial or default on any obligations that I have to other people.
But there'll still be some time. If you're publishing a book more or less every 2 or so years, and you're not writing every day, you've said that. What are you doing, I guess, in the period when you've just published one and you're kind of brooding over what you will be writing? How do you tend to spend those days whilst thinking things
well,
through?
as I say in the book, I've tried to do other things. I tried to write for films. I've tried to get a job. I chair a charity, a literary charity, which takes up some time. Go to the pictures, go to the theatre, read lots. Play tennis, but I don't really like not writing anything, so I'll always be trying to be fiddle around with something. I find I had a year in which I wrote nothing, which was in 2003. I mean, for various reasons. I had a book coming out at the end of the year, and the editing process went on and on and on, and then there was a lot of publicity, and so the whole of the calendar year 2023. I didn't do anything, and I felt very frustrated by that and quite grumpy, really.
When you are writing with your 1,000 words a day, ideally, and you've said that some days you'll be tuning up what you've done yesterday. How perfect does it need to be first time round for you?
Well, I get it pretty right first time, really. Well, that's not quite right. I mean, at the end of the day, those 1,000 words I will have gone over them, 30, 40 times. But at the end of the day, I'm pretty happy with the 1,000 words I've done. And so when people talk about, here's a draft of my novel, I think, well, what's that? I mean, if you think it's provisional, why are you handing it in? We'll go back and finish it.
Has that always been the case, though, Sebastian? Or is this something that you've learned along the way, just to fine tune it as you're going?
No, I think that's always been the way, and maybe that's just the way I am. I wouldn't want to put the lid back on the typewriter or log off the computer, or if I didn't think that it was as good as I could get it on the day. Again, maybe that's also something to do with having been a journalist. You can't hand in a story which you haven't really finished or haven't checked, or you're not quite sure what's happened. You don't hand it in.
We get quite technical. Some might say nerdy. I prefer niche. You've mentioned the reluctant move to a laptop, but what software are you writing on? And most importantly, what fonts do you prefer, Sebastian?
I've only ever used Apple, really. I had 3 or 4, Bill Gatesy things, but they were no good at all. They were always freezing. So I had to pay a bit more money and get Apple, and that's always worked fine. It's very easy to use. But I do use Word for Apple, which is it's a Microsoft program, isn't it? So I don't know why Apple doesn't have a equally good word processing program of its own. And one of the weird things I noticed when I was a judge of a prize about 5 years ago, I think it was the Sunday Times Short Story Prize or somebody's Short Story Prize, is that 95% of the entries were in sans serif font. I thought, Christ, when did that happen? And I think it's just because it's the default font of a lot of laptops. But I mean, I very quickly switch out of Palatino into something else. Century Times New Roman, or the last book I wrote is in Bell. I just wanted to spell MT, it's called. It's very like Times New Roman. It's sort of quite chunky, big serifs. But it's nice.
And just one more question about the intricacies of the day. When it is one of those days where it's not really working, what have you learned helps you out, just helps to try and, I guess, reset your mind, as you say?
Well, I think just clearing your mind, going away, doing something else, physical exercise is quite good. But if you're really stuck, sometimes I will talk things through with someone. I mean, I remember in Birdsong when the first part of the book is a love affair between two people, and then time passes, and then we move into a different world, which is during the First World War. And basically, the two lovers of the first part would never have met again. But I knew that there was an expectation in the reader, to come back to one of your early questions, that they should meet again. Otherwise, the reader is going to feel that the emotion they've invested in the first part of the book has not been repaid. And I just couldn't really think how they might. And I remember explaining to my wife, I said, I need you as a reader to tell me, what you think and how they might meet and what would happen. So I talked her through the whole book up to that point, and it took about an hour and a half. But the good thing was she said, bloody hell, it sounds really good. Anyway, we talked through. So you can talk these things through. But I don't. I find it's quite a sort of private business, and I don't really like doing that. But then when you finished, I'm very open to editorial suggestions at a high level. But
what do you mean by that, at a high level?
What I mean, I don't think there's no editor who knows more about technique or words or meanings or phrases or punctuation than I do. So there's never anything like that. Except actually when it comes to the copy edit, which is really the final fiddly thing. However many hundreds of times you've read it, your eye still sometimes fails to pick up the fact that you've used the word trumpet twice, 3 lines apart. Just, one has a certain blindness over that. But so what I mean by at a high level is, the editor will say, I like this character a lot, and I like the arc of her story, but might she be built up a little more? Might we have one more scene with her in the first part of the book? Something like that.
You mentioned technique, Sebastian, a couple of times, which I find pretty fascinating because I speak to a lot of authors, and quite a few of them will shy away from talking about the technical aspects of it, whereas you do. Even though, as you said before, perhaps when you think about that too actively, it can make you feel self-conscious. But how much are you learning still on the go about technique and about how you can tweak yours, perhaps even improve it? How actively are you thinking about that when you write?
I think that's really impossible to know. I mean, that's like asking someone, tell me what is in your unconscious. Well, if it's it's unconscious, ergo I can't. If it was not, if I could tell you what it was, it wouldn't be unconscious. But I think about it a lot, and I read a lot, still with a sense of, is there something I can deduce here? I used to get a lot of ideas from very bad books, I used to do a lot of reviewing, and I'd be sent novels, and I thought, "Would think this is really terrible." And then I'd say to myself, "But why is it so bad?" And the reason being this or that or the other. So I learned a lot from that. But now I don't have to read a lot of bad books anymore. But I still read people and think, "Oh, that works really well. How did they do that? Maybe I could learn. Was it because it was prefigured cleverly there, or because is it paradoxical because we weren't expecting it, or is it rubbing up against stereotype, or is it, what? Why does it work? Is it simply the words they've chosen? And very often it's the words they've chosen. I mean, I remember having a very interesting conversation. Well, not very interesting, but something I've always remembered with a very clever guy who worked in finance, who was a ferocious reader, American. He would read sort of 3 books a week while making millions, doing hedge fundy things. And he said, why is it that Charlotte Gray, a book of mine, I was so intensely there. I enjoyed it so much. And yet the story, when you think about it, and I said, well, I guess it's just the words I chose and the way I put it. And he said, oh, you mean if someone else had written it but chosen different words in the sentences, it wouldn't have worked so well? I said, yeah, that's what writing is. And it's amazing how a lot of people that hasn't occurred to them. And a lot of books very good books tell very ordinary stories, really. A boy meets girl, or boy grows up, or dad dies, or something. And some of them resonate with you as beautiful Chekhovian masterpieces, and some of them you think, I wouldn't print this in Woman's Realm. It is the words you choose.
The new one is a memoir, Fires Which Burned Brightly, and to just touch on a few things that I do know about you, and I know that when you were growing up, you've said that you've always wanted to be a novelist.
Yeah.
Way back then, when you were surrounded by books and you did want to be a novelist, what did you imagine being a novelist would be?
Well, when I was 15, when, I was didn't know anything about anything really, I thought being a novelist would be something that would allow me to express my revolutionary zeal and my criticism of the modern world, but in a way that was respectable and would not get me sent to prison, but might even win me some small respect and regard. But I didn't think it was really going to be a job or a living. So when I was a bit older, sort of 21 too, when I'd left university and I started trying to write novels, I always thought, well, I'd better have a job as well. And that was what everybody did. I mean, even successful authors of that period, I'm now talking about the late 70s. If you think of people like Iris Murdoch or Kingsley Amis or Anthony Burgess or John Fowles, most of them were married to somebody who had a proper job, or lived with somebody who had a proper job, or themselves did teaching, or whatever. So that was how I sort of saw it. That's how I saw what it would be, something that would express my dissatisfaction with the world in a beautiful and artistic shape, that would not get me into trouble, but was not really going to make much of a living either.
And now in 2025, how has the reality matched the dreamy expectation of a 15-year-old?
They are very different. I feel incredibly fortunate that I was publishing at a time. I'm thinking particularly of the 20 years between 1990 and 2010, which saw an extraordinary boom time for what you might call serious fiction or literary fiction or whatever people call it. And so my generation's equivalent of Iris Murdoch, Anthony Burgess, John Feld, blah, 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 sold, literally 10 times as many books, and made 10 times as much money. And I suppose this was very largely due to do with book selling itself. And in the 60s, early 70s, when I first started going into bookshops, you'd read a new book by an author you admired, maybe Graham Greene or somebody, and you'd go into W.H. Smith's, and they didn't have it because Smith's didn't really have anything. So then in most towns, there'd be a little boutique-y independent bookshop run by a couple of gentlemen in bow ties. And you'd go in and say, can I buy the new Graham Greene, which I saw, reviewed in the papers at the weekend? And they'd say, well, we had a copy, but I'm afraid Mrs. Bloggins got it. And you'd say, all right. And they said, we can order you one, but it'll take 2 or 3 weeks. And then Waterstones came along and said, we won't just order one, we'll order 400 and we'll pile them on the floor. And we'll have huge, warehouse-like bookshops on the high street. And of course, that's going to cost us a lot of money. Therefore, we will have to cut back what we're going to pay to the publisher and the author for the book. But instead of selling, 1,500, you're going to sell 15,000. So although what you get per book will be less, you're going to sell an awful lot more. So you're going to make a lot more and sell a lot more, and so on and so forth. So that was one very important thing. And the other important thing was, I think that, there were just a lot more exciting new writers, really. And the novel had fallen in the 70s, I think, particularly into a terrible rut. I'm not talking here about genre stuff. I really don't know anything about that, but the so-called literary novel had become very tired, and it was just people really writing about themselves and their neighbors in thin disguise. And then people like Salman Rushdie, Ishiguro, and others began to tell stories, and make stuff up. And making stuff up, guess what? That proved to be exciting and rewarding, and readers liked it.
I know that it took you a while to write something that was publishable, I think 4 tries, and then you've had big moments of success. What do you remember about a moment where really everything changed for you? That one moment where you thought, oh, okay, maybe my life won't be the same from this.
I think that my second book, The Girl at the Lion d'Or, I think the critical reception to that made me think, maybe I can do this. And then, as far as in practical terms, Birdsong, when it went into paperback, it didn't sell particularly well in hardback, but when it went into paperback, and it stayed in the bestseller list for years, really, that made a very big difference from a purely practical point of view.
Did you remember the weight of that change when it did go into paperback and suddenly it was selling more than you had imagined?
I remember being, surprised. But, I never had a sort of moment when I ran around the streets throwing my hat in the air, because we had 2 small children and another one on the way. And I was just thinking about the practicalities of that and what I was going to write next. Where was I going to find something that was not going to disappoint a readership that had responded so warmly to that book. So I never really had that sort of goal celebration, if you know what I mean, which sounds a bit odd, I suppose, and disappointing. But I was 39 when I wrote Birdsong and 40 when it came out. And had I had a sort of bestseller on that level when I was 25, who knows? I might have gone, out snorting coke all night and, never been the same. But I had too many worries about the mortgage.
And that is it for this week's episode. Thank you so much to Sebastian Faulks for coming on the show, telling us how he got that memoir down, Fires Which Burned Brightly, and just helping us run through his career, how he does it, where and when he writes his books. Now, if you want to get a copy of the book, please do use the link in the description, because that will take you through to our bookshop.org page. That way, a bit goes to Sebastian, it goes to this podcast and your local independent bookshop as well, so it's a win-win-win. Do subscribe to the channel so podcasts automatically download, and search for Writer's Routine wherever you get your shows, because there's almost 400 episodes there with some of the biggest names in publishing. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this show, you can support us on Patreon and Ko-Fi. Give the episode a thumbs up too, and I will see you next week with a brand new guest on the podcast.